On tonight's episode, we feature 6 terrifying, no-sleep style stories, written and designed to haunt your dreams. Lock your windows, lock your doors, and enter the alternate nightmare. The other day I found something I probably shouldn't have. I worked as a park ranger for the San Bernardino County National Forest in California. I have wanted to be a ranger all my life ever since I first saw Smokey Bear in his preventing wildfire commercials on TV. I'm not a ranger who usually leads around groups, though on occasion, I have. My main job is to look for the wildlife and lead search and rescue teams if a hiker gets lost. Recently on a rescue trip, I had found a couple who were lost climbing back up the ridge from a steep stream climb. It was miraculous that I found them at all. The only reason why I noticed them was because I saw something in the distance that I had noticed before. It looked like the corner of a gray building. When I peeked over to get a better view of it, the woman spotted me, and I called a rescue helicopter for help on the radio. From what I could tell, the man had fallen off the side of the ridge and slid down into the creek. I looked for a way down and eventually found a safer way, but it took me about 10 minutes to walk around safely to get to them. By then, the helicopter was just arriving. He looked like he fell on his ankle pretty badly, and best case scenario, it was only fractured. I told him he would be okay, and I helped him and the woman onto the helicopter. As we took off, I looked around the area to try and spot that building that I thought I saw. I couldn't see it anywhere. I bandaged up the man's ankle on the way back to the medical facility. Our doctor got him settled while I went back to my office to report what happened. Intentionally left the building. I thought I saw out of the report, not because I had something to hide or anything, but because I wasn't sure if I had actually seen it. The next day I went back to that area to try and find that building. I had seen the ridge where the man had fallen, so I stepped close to where he was before he had lost, or at least to my closest approximation. That's when I saw it. The man must have also seen the corner of the building, so it was real. That weird thing was it was heavily surrounded by trees, and I had not read any reports or emails before about a building being out here. So I climbed down the ridge and headed towards it. I entered the thick area of trees that I thought were surrounding it when I stopped because I spotted something. I crept forward slowly, and I was right. Something was in front of me, running toward the direction of the building. As I got closer to the area, I noticed scratches in the trees. Whatever it was leaving a trail to know how to get back, or scratches were already there, and they were on their way back to the building. That would mean they were trying to find a way out and not a way back. I took my time following the scratches, so I didn't catch up to whoever it was that I was following. Finally, I made my way to a small clearing. There was a door to a small shack-sized building. It almost looked like a stone porta-potty, but slightly wider. The door had a card reader on it, so it was security protected like some of our buildings back at the main grounds. I took my card out and scanned it. The security panel turned green, meaning that I was authorized inside. I opened the door to steps that led underground to a dark corridor. There was a light at the end of the hallway as I could see someone walking towards the end of it, and I saw they disappeared into the room beyond that. The long corridor had 3 turns to the right in the room that was beyond it. I walked to the first one and peeked around. I saw that inside was what looked like a locker room possibly. There were benches and drawers in there, and on the walls were full bodysuits with a window covering to see through. There were orange suits, which I had seen before. We had used those to take care of hazmat procedures when a large animal had been dead in the forest for a while. We have to be careful when handling something like that because animals that have been dead that long may have attracted diseases that you wouldn't be able to see without a microscope. What I didn't recognize was the other suits in there. They were blue and green. I had no idea what those would be used for. I walked farther down to the next room and peeked in. I saw more of the suits, but inside was an actual locker room with lockers. I looked around, and they all seemed to have locks on them, but one that was empty. The third door down I saw was just a custodial area. It seemed like it had more things in it than a standard closet might. It, of course, had the basic things like mops and trash cans. What I thought was odd, though, is it also had a stack of body bags. I wondered if this is where they took the dead animals after we had recovered them. That would make sense why they would have full orange bodysuits. I looked around the door at the end of the corridor, and inside, It was huge. The room was as large as an airplane hangar, but it was filled with what looked like laboratory and testing equipment. I walked over to a table that was against the wall that had files on it. They were spread out haphazardly. Some of them showed a description of test subjects 4 Fahrenheit through 9A. Other papers detailed that the serums hadn't yet worked, but they were still trying to find the correct sequence to fix the pathogen. I didn't understand any of what it showed, but the word pathogen. It seemed to me that the facility was working on finding a cure for some kind of disease. I know they told us that some of the animals might have had infections, and that's why we wore the suits, but I didn't think it was that bad. I walked through the room, looking at all the equipment, when I noticed that the other side of the room at one point had caught on fire. The walls and ceiling were black with damage, but on the table was a small cube that looked like it had been untouched. It was a weird dark smoky gray color. It may have been what caused the fire. I picked it up and immediately had a massive headache and started to hear bizarre things. People were screaming, but I couldn't listen to what they were yelling at me. The headache stopped, and I noticed a man in a white lab coat staring at me from across the room. He was holding a clipboard and a coffee mug, which he dropped when he saw me. It crashed on the floor, and he started running into another corridor. I ran after him, telling him to wait. I chased him through the hall, which had offices and smaller lab rooms on either side. He ran into one of the offices and shut the door behind him, locking it. I asked him through the door what was going on here. He said I wasn't allowed here, that I shouldn't be there. I told him I was a ranger for the park. I noted that it was okay for me to be there because my key card let me in. He said it didn't matter who I was, that I needed to leave now before it was too late. I said that I was friendly and that I wasn't going to hurt him. He noted that it wasn't me that he was afraid of. He said again that I should leave while I still had the chance. Through the small window in the door, I saw him run to the back of the office and hide under the desk that was in there. I banged on the door, asking him why I needed to leave and what he was scared of. I started looking around for something to open the door when I saw it. At the farther end of the corridor, I saw this cloaked figure. It was the same color as the cube that I had picked up. The figure was the shape of a person, but it looked like it was made of smoke or gas. It started moving and coming toward me. I started stepping back towards the other end of the corridor. It was coming after me. It didn't have a face or eyes or legs. It was just a smoke figure that was coming in my direction. That's what the guy in the lab coat was scared of. It started coming after me much faster, and I turned to run. I ran as quickly as possible to the open room and started pulling the lab tables and equipment down. I looked back while I ran to see if that made it slow down, but the figure only phased right through them. I turned into the first hallway, thinking I couldn't outrun it. So, I needed to hide somewhere. The lockers were too obvious, even if it did take that thing to look for a while to find me. So, I did the only other thing that made sense. I ran into the first room with the stack of body bags and climbed in one, and pulled the rest of the stack on top of me before I zipped it up. I zipped it enough, just enough so I could see out of it. The smoke figure passed by the room, and I thought I was safe. I hear thunderous bangs coming through the other room. Whatever that thing was doing, it was echoing loudly through the corridors. There was a silence, then I heard the same noise happening again, though not as loud. The smoke figure came into the janitorial room I was in briefly, but it didn't notice me. That must have been the scariest part. It entered the room and floated around, looking for me, but it didn't see me under the body bags. I waited for what must have been 2 hours under those before I decided to check if it was safe. I quietly crept down the corridor to the locker room and saw that all the lockers were thrown about. These lockers must have been an easy 500 pounds each, and that smoke thing just tossed them like nothing. There were huge indents into some of them like a wrecking ball hit it. I looked out of the room and snuck to the first room. The same thing had happened in there that happened in the locker room. The benches were in half, and the dressers were thrown and broken into many pieces. I made it back up the steps and left the facility. I found the trees with the marks and just ran in that direction. I somehow made it out of there alive. I don't know how I did, but I did. That night I fell asleep trying to figure out what the smoke figure was. I had never seen anything like that in my life. The following day I wasn't allowed into the offices because the security had stopped me. They told me to hand over my gear and my key card. I asked them what was going on, and they said that I had been fired. I asked them why, and he said he heard it was because my performance for the past couple of months has been slipping, and they couldn't trust someone like that to be leading the search and rescue teams. I was devastated. I worked there for 4 years as a search and rescue lead and 3 years before that as a groundskeeper. I know they didn't fire me because I was slacking on work. Instead, they fired me because I saw something I wasn't supposed to. I wanted to investigate it further, but I wasn't allowed back into the park after that day. I don't know what it was, but it was a smoke figure with something to do with that cube. It could have been something alien, or it could have been an experiment gone very wrong in their secret labs. I guess I will never know. I'm posting this under a fake name and account, so I can't be traced. But this needs to get out there so people can begin to find out about this creature that we so wrongfully made. About 4 years ago, we started genetic experiments on a new hybrid creature. It was thoroughly tested in the field and was deemed ready, but something in the development stages went wrong. We began tests on these new creatures, which were part canine, part crocodile. Some people called it a croc dog, which is what it is called now. I guess that is a decent name, considering the lab name it was given. These creatures were constructed from the DNA of crocodiles of northern Florida and species of canines such as husky, retriever, and German shepherd. We thought that if we could make a chimera-like creature with the strong abilities of the crocodile and discipline of a canine, we would have the perfect companion for our troop overseas. They could have them breach and hold clear buildings of dangerous enemies before they got there. At first, we thought it would have specific traits, like a crocodile's scales and manner and a canine's discipline and duty. Some of those things we got, and during the testing stage, we had great results. In open combat simulations, they had performed amazingly. Our handlers were able to train them just like they had trained any other dog. But we did have to change some training scenarios. Our testing coordinator was bitten when one of the pups would hunt down a target and subdue them by biting them. And it didn't end well. The ferocity of a dog and teeth of a crocodile was a dangerous combination. Even with the bite pad on his arm, he had to get surgery to repair the tendons in his arm. If it were a live operation in the field, the target would have been missing their entire arm. And these were just year-old pups. They weren't even mature enough with their full strength, and they still had what was considered to be baby teeth. Eventually, we had to discontinue the project because when the pups got older, they figured out that they didn't need handlers or discipline as humans. So we gave them. The dogs with discipline issues began attacking their handlers and the other pups. Some of them were trying to help their handlers during the fight as they were disciplined well enough. Not all of them were a problem, but they did become one. They had broken out of the facility, and after weeks of searching and hunting them down, we only found about 3 of the 7 that had escaped. Finally, the program director was ordered to scrap the project, and we had to put all of them down. Even the obedient ones. I'm only writing about this today because I found one of them in the wild, and those that don't know about this need to be careful. I live in Georgia, just north of the testing facility, and I had seen a few of the pups running around. They couldn't be even a year-old yet. They had different features, though. Their snout was longer and their teeth arranged differently. They had a longer tail, and their scales were all over their body now, not just their back and hind legs. I also saw that they could swim and breathe underwater as crocodiles could. It didn't make sense to see different variations of these croc dogs that we had genetically made in the wild. But eventually, I pieced it together. The ones that escaped became adults and were mating with the local wildlife, so that would explain the extra features. I had found them one day when I was driving to the facility for a different job. We are in an undisclosed location, but it is in a well-hidden area. I saw them down a slope in a part of the swamp. They were playing and fighting with each other. I didn't see any of the older ones there, so I quietly got out of my car and slid down the embankment behind a tree to see them up close. They had gotten together while wrestling. It seemed to be about 3 of them. I took out my phone and got a picture of them, but I forgot to turn off the sound. They saw me, and I began walking back slowly. They got up and started stalking me. I knew I had to do this, or I might not have gotten out of that in one piece, or at all. I remembered what that first one had done during the training exercise. He almost lost his arm, and that was with the guard on. I didn't want to know what 3 could do with no protection. Thinking about that made me panic, so I turned and ran. I got up the embankment, but I could hear their paws clomping loud behind me into the mud. I almost slipped in it and fell, but I staggered and caught myself. I felt one of them bite into my left hip and only get away with the fabric of my pants and part of my leather belt. I had gotten away and scrambled into my car. One of them got their head stuck between the car door as I slammed it shut. I could hear it crying and whimpering. The other two were biting at the door in the car. One of them broke the side view mirror entirely off. I started the car as quickly as I could and drove off. The two tried to keep up with me but eventually gave up. When I got to the facility, I showed security my badge and told them to keep an eye out for anything trying to get in. I went to the director and told him what had happened, and he was nervous about it. He knew if any news of those got out, it would be his head on the chopping block. I didn't need medical treatment, thankfully enough. Those pups had no training, so they didn't get me too wrong. I only had a semi-deep bite wound from one of their teeth that healed in about a week. I know it was ordered for them to be hunted down and killed, but after 3 years of them escaping and already having hybrid pups, who knows how many different subspecies of them are out there? If you are anywhere in northern Florida or southern Georgia, be careful around the swamp areas. We don't know how many of them could still be out there. I once dated this girl when I was in college. She was a junior, and I was a sophomore. I did almost anything to please this girl. That's kind of how it was back then. If you wanted to date the hot chicks when you were a younger grade than them, you stuck it out and did whatever you had to do to be with them. My friend at the time had a theory. The hotter they were, the crazier they were, and I had to agree with that to a point. This girl liked to do things that not many would do. She would ride crazy roller coaster rides and try and high-five people sitting behind her when we were going down a significant drop. She would stalk classmates from class to their dorm just so she could jump scare them. For some reason, she also had this thing with making real-looking paper mache snakes and leaving them in her friends' dorms that I thought was quite hilarious, actually. But one thing really did make me question if it was really worth being with her at the time. One of her hobbies included researching and practicing witchcraft. On a few occasions, she would ask me to bring a dead animal with me when I came to see her after class. One day, she decided to take it a little farther. After class, we went out on a late date, and she wanted me to meet her at the cemetery. Not only did she openly mock the dead just to see if she could get a literal rise out of them, but she would sometimes dig up bodies from the graves and take their bones for her witchcraft. I told her that was one thing I would not do. When I got there, she told me to relax because we would try something else that day. She had brought her car, and I pulled 2 chairs and a table out the back of it. She pulled a box from the front, and I saw an Ouija board inside. I told her she must have been kidding with all this. She told me that I could leave if I was going to be a chicken about it. I gave her a dumb look and pretended to go along with whatever crazy plan she decided we were going to do. She took out the board and lit candles at the edge of the table. Along with the Ouija board, she set down a small black bowl and lit a fire with matchsticks and some dried grass. She pulled out some dirt from another bowl, sprinkled it into the fire, and grabbed my hands, placing them on the Ouija board. She called out to the graveyard if anything was there. I didn't dare try and play around with her at this point, so whatever was going to happen, I was going to let it. The tile began to move, and it settled on yes. She asked what was the name of the thing there with us. The tile started to move, but it was moving around more than it should. She told me that there were multiple spirits there, and they were fighting to take control of talking to us. After a few minutes, the tile stopped moving and began to move again. It spelled out the word Dallas. A spirit named Dallas was talking to us. She asked him how he had died. The tile moved around to spell out the word murder. Before she had a chance to ask him something else, the tile was moving again. It spelled out the words leave, runs, be gone. She asked Dallas why she shouldn't be there. It spelled out the word restless. With that, she stood up and told me to start packing up everything. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me when a spirit tells you to leave, you leave. I thought she was playing with me the whole time, but she said the word restless was different than the spirit saying something else. When a heart mentions the word restless, it's almost like it is a contagious disease. Any other soul in the area of another restless one also became restless. That meant more spirits being attracted there, and not all of them would be friendly. I don't know why I stayed with that girl as long as I did. She was clearly into more crazy things in a week than I probably was in my whole life. After that, I still saw her in class every now and then, but the rumor was that she was getting into much darker stuff than when I was with her. Guess I got off that crazy wagon just in time. Last year, I went vacationing out to Lake Michigan. I never liked vacationing with my family. I had one of those families that always wanted to do everything together. I never really fit into that structure of a family. I am a social outcast, both in the world and in my family. So any time I had alone to myself was the only time I felt like I could actually breathe. So when we went to Michigan, I thought it would be the same thing, and in a sense, it was, but I never thought it would turn out the way it did. I turned 14 the week after the vacation, and all I wanted was some room to breathe. And for the first time in my life, I had gotten that. When we went, my dad had gotten me my room in the hotel we were staying at. It was right next door to my parents' room, but it was the first time I felt like I had my own space. I could watch whatever TV I wanted to. I could have time to read my book. I had been trying to get time to read for months. It was something so small, but to have my own space and privacy was something different. In the room, they had a few flyers for things to do near the lake area. I flipped through some of them, and the one that caught my eye was an underwater adventure. It was similar to something like an aquatic park. So the following day I told my dad if we could go to the place that I had seen in the flyers, and he said that I could go by myself. The area that they were going to wasn't far from that place, so he agreed. They dropped me off at the lakeside aquatic area. I looked around, seeing the everyday things that a place like that would have. They had booths for little kid games and other things. I walked to the room where they had, and I was amazed by it. It was a large area with a big window facing the lakeside that they had divided for just the park. There were schools of fish, some larger fish, and I even saw a whale shark. It was a fantastic sight. We watched as somebody from above the gigantic area dumped large amounts of some kind of fish feed in the water. All of the fish went crazy going after the feast. It was like a gigantic buffet feeding them from above. What I thought was interesting, though, was that there was a fish swimming towards the lake's bottom that was not interested in the feeding party at the top of the lake. It was a blackfish, and it was swimming slowly. I couldn't tell if it had eaten already or not, but I got close to the glass and saw that it wasn't a fish at all. Instead, it looked as if it were some kind of decoy fish. It had sunk towards the bottom, and something was creeping upon it. Some kind of creature caught it and began biting into it. It was some kind of man, but he was biting into it. I was so confused about what was going on. It saw that I was watching it, and it swam to the corner of the window there I was watching it. It wasn't a man at all. It was some kind of aquatic humanoid. I don't know if what I was looking at was real or not, but it looked like it was looking back at me. It was right in front of me, and it looked remarkable. It had a human face, but it was as if it were alien because it looked at me with as much curiosity as I had about it. It had the shape of a human and everything, but it had big eyes that were completely black. So I didn't know if somebody was messing with me, so I left the room to talk to somebody that worked there. I asked them about the fish man in the viewing room, and they said they didn't know what nonsense I was talking about. So I looked for someone else to find, but no one else was around, so I went back to the viewing room. I looked around for it again, and it was swimming behind a fish. It grabbed it with its webbed hands and took a bite out of it. I could see that it had highly sharp teeth because it had torn through that fish in no time at all. I thought that that was amazing. I guess someone else had seen the creature I was talking about, too, and one of the feeders above the viewing room was looking for it. They had a long pole in the water searching for it. It had an underwater camera on it looking in the water. The fish man saw that and swam off. He swam towards the other side of the divided area and squeezed through the hole in the net where the small fish went in and out. To this day, I don't know what it is that I saw, or if anyone had seen anything like it, but it seemed like it had been in that lake for a long time. It could still be out there, and nobody would know. If it knew to hide from the camera, then it must have been there before. It must have been going in and out of the aquatic park. I had told my parents about it when they picked me up. They laughed at me, making up silly things from all the books that I read. They didn't believe me, but I knew somebody had to. I know somebody, at least one person, who had seen what I had seen. It couldn't have been just me. One of my favorite things I used to do was go to the beach. But after what I saw, it's not my favorite anymore. I live in Kingsville, Texas, so the shore isn't far from me. There are many along the coast, but I just can't go anymore. I'm too scared to. I can't really explain why, but I think I saw some kind of sea monster. The day this happened, I was supposed to meet my 2 girlfriends, but they had to cancel. So, it ended up just being me going by myself. I didn't mind since I understood they had hectic jobs. Besides, I was usually busy, so I thought I could enjoy a beach day to myself. When I got to the beach, it wasn't crowded, as this one usually wasn't. The beach I went to wasn't trendy, so it allowed for a lot more free space and fewer people to stare at you. I'm not sure they even had lifeguards on that beach. When I got there, I picked a spot and set up my beach chair and umbrella. There were only about 5 other people there in a group, but they were farther down the beach. So, I really had that part of the beach to myself. I laid out on my chair and saw lines in the sand. They led to a giant pit of missing sand that had multiple holes of sand missing. It didn't look like someone had moved it, but as if it were sinking in on itself. Then one of the holes moved, and something was coming out of it. It was a mole, or that's what it looked like. It was a small-looking rodent kind of creature. It crawled out of the sand hole, ran to the water, came out with a starfish in its mouth, and crawled back into its hole. I thought that it was weird that something like that was on a beach. I watched as the rodent went back and forth, bringing back small fish or other things in its mouth. Every time it came out of the water, it had more and more in its mouth, as if something were making the small fish and ocean life get pushed onto the shore. I walked down to the shoreline to see, and as the tide went out, I saw dead fish, starfish, and other things get washed up on the beach by the hundreds. I don't know what compelled me to see what it was, but doing that was a mistake. I dived into the water past the dead fish and swam slowly while I looked around. I couldn't see anything because the water was dark for some reason, and I came back up for air and floated above the water to see if I could see anything. After getting a little farther away, I swam back under the tide and looked around. It was still hard to see, but I could figure it further out in the water. It had something black coming from it, and I could see that it had long tentacles. I thought it was just a giant octopus, but I counted how many it had, and I counted 12. I don't know much about sea life, but I don't think I had ever heard about an octopus with 12 tentacles. I went up for air and felt my skin starting to itch. Whatever that black stuff was that was coming from, it was irritating my skin. I started swimming back, but my whole body started to hurt. I could feel my nerves starting to pulse large amounts of pain to my arms and legs. The longer I was in the water and the longer I swam, the more my body was hurting. The water was cold earlier, but right now, it felt like it was 150 degrees and was burning me all over. I was getting closer to the shore, but my body started to seize up, and I was floating to shore because I physically couldn't move anymore. Whatever that black stuff was, it had paralyzed me. Do you know how scary it is to be floating in the open sea and not able to control where you are going? In my head, I began freaking out. Eventually, the pain got to my head, and it made me pass out. I woke up later, lying on the sand to someone shaking me. The group that was farther down the beach had saved me. 2 of the guys jumped in and pulled me back to safety. I was so grateful for them and glad they were there. If it weren't for them, I don't think I would be alive today. Either way, I'm not ever going back to the beach again, or at least any beach in Texas ever again. When I was a young lad, I would spend my time out on the dock by the harbor and ask traveling seafarers if maybe one day I could take up in their ranks and sail the seas with them. Many of them had no time for me, so at times it could be a letdown. But I was pretty brave for a 10-year-old. I knew how dangerous the seas could be, and that only made me want to go out there even more. I had all the guts and all the spunk in the world. No wave nor shark, no impossible kraken could break my stride. Some of the older crew who thought I was ignorant called me names and said it's kids like me who go out on their first voyage and die on the first couple of nights. Mainly it's due to them not knowing a thing about the sea and the fall overboard and getting caught under the propellers. Sad to say, but it happened all too often. That's how one of my older cousins had died, but I was determined to not let that be the case for me. I was set on learning everything I could about the sea before taking my first step onto a boat and into the sea. Sure, I paddled out in the bay sometimes with my old man, but that was not the same. I wanted real excitement. I wanted to be hundreds of lengths out with no land in sight and breathe in pure saltwater air. The city life was too much for me. I despised cars and what they did to the environment. I'm sure boats weren't any better, but at least the ocean was more significant than their pollution. So, during my days when I had no studies, I would go out to the docks, looking for any of the ship's crew who were taking a rest. Most times, I was shooed away, but on the rare occasions that they didn't get rid of me, I would ask them everything about the life of the sea. I would ask them about day-to-day life, how to catch certain types of fish or other mammals that lived in, and how hard it was to be out on the water for weeks, sometimes months at a time. Most told me that you just learn on the go and get used to being on the sea. Sometimes the land would be difficult to adjust back to after being on the ocean for so long, but it wasn't unbearable. One day, I found some sailors sitting outside a bar together. I overheard them talking over some stories of what sounded like nightmares. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but one of them noticed me and told me to take a seat with them. I politely declined until I heard one of them start to talk about sharks. Usually, I would stay away from the drunks and people at bars as they get rowdy all too quickly, especially the sailors. But at the time, I loved sharks. One told a story of how he saw a shark that ate a whole family of sea otters. Another sailor said a story of how he once saw a shark bite a whale, and it was disgusting and haunting because of how close to the ship they were. At the end of the table, a man laughed and sipped his drink, smiling at the amusing stories. One of the sailors asked him what was so funny. The man stood up and began walking to her side of the table. He said that they didn't know what fear was. He lifted his leg and set it on the table in front of them. But his leg wasn't a log at all. It was a peg leg. I hadn't noticed before, but this man was much older than the rest up close. His name was Peter Evans. He sat down and began telling a story that made me seriously consider not ever being a sailor at all. He said that 13 years ago, he and his crew were on a voyage that took them all the way out to the South Atlantic, searching for a rare kind of crab that sold mainly on the seafood market. There were 11 crew members plus him. Telling us that story, I assumed he was a captain, but he said during the time he wasn't. They sailed out on the Mary Sue, led by Captain August McClapton. He was a legend of the older sailors and had at least 500 voyages under his belt, almost 200 of those as the captain. His entire crew would die for him if need be, but they never thought it would come to that. This voyage that took them so far out already started badly. It would eventually take them 8 days to get there. After that, everything was smooth sailing until the third day. On the night of day 3, they had a major thunderstorm that made all of their equipment go haywire and completely mess up their direction. The captain tried his best to steer in the right direction, but the waves only increased that night. It took a whole day for the system engineer to fix the equipment to get back on course. On day 5, they had heard that a hurricane was forming off the east coast of the US and was headed in their direction. Reluctantly, the captain put the ship at full speed while Peter and the rest of the crew secured all the equipment and everything that wasn't tied down. One of the other crewmen slipped while securing one of the cages and twisted his ankle pretty badly. Out of the lot of them, Peter knew the most about first aid care. He took him to the mess room and bandaged up his ankle as best he could, but he knew that he wouldn't be able to help the rest of them when they got to the fishing spot. One down, that was going to make it harder for the rest of them. On night 7, they were all asleep in their bunks when Peter was dreaming of something odd. He said he was dreaming of a pretty woman singing a lullaby to him. It was very strange to him because he couldn't think of any more in his town that he was hardly attracted to. But the woman in his dream was one of the most beautiful women he could think of. He woke up, confused about the odd goal, and sat up in his bed. Tired, he walked to the mess room for a cup of water. When he spotted the other crewmen, he helped bandage up. He was walking out towards the deck. He didn't think much of it until he heard him humming the same song that Peter had heard in his dream. He called out to the crewmen, saying he shouldn't go out to the badly injured deck. But he continued walking out onto the deck. Peter stepped outside to get his attention and called to him, but the rainout made it impossible. The crewman walked to the edge, and Peter reached for him, but the crewman fell overboard and began drifting off. He ran to the control room, woke the captain from his chair, and turned on the on-speaker for the whole crew to hear shouting, Man overboard. Everyone was on deck trying to grab the man or throw him a line within a few minutes. Two of the crewmen were about to dive in after him when Peter had stopped them. Peter spotted a large shadow swimming in the water that grabbed the crewman and pulled him deep below just before they were about to jump in. They felt the ship jolt forward and saw the crewman's body come up the other side, in multiple pieces, and an extensive trail of blood. Peter cursed at whatever thing had done that to him, and the captain insisted that they try to get some sleep, but how could they? They had just watched one of their colleagues, hell, one of their friends, get chopped to bits by the ship's propeller, because something decided he was too large to eat whole. He didn't even have a chance. On the 8th night, the hurricane had caught up with them. The captain thought that they would have made it, but no. They tried their best to hold out, but the waves kept getting higher and higher. Again, they tried their best to hold on, but evidently, it was the weight of the cages that pulled them under. Thankfully, everyone had made it somehow alive. The boat had sunk, but they all were busy, floating on a piece of driftwood, or one of the cages that happened to be afloat from the floating device that activated inside them being damaged. They weren't safe yet though. The waves were pulling them harder away from each other. Some of them got caught under the waves and drifted in different directions. Finally, Peter got launched, and out of desperation, he closed himself inside one of the cages. He knew he would get tossed around still, but if he got inside of it, nothing could get to him, or so he thought. He didn't know how many hours he was stuck in there, but only one thing came to his mind before he was left unconscious. He thought of that beautiful woman in his dream and imagined her singing him that song. It was so vivid he could almost hear it. He woke up still inside the cage, lying on a beach. He spat the sand out of his mouth and tried opening the cage when he got his bearing together. He could see the other side of the beach, so it wasn't a big piece of land, probably only 35 or 40 meters wide. To the left of him, he saw shallow water. To the right, he saw bodies scattered across the beach. The other crew lay dead, their chests bleeding and ripped open. His captain was gasping for air, with his legs still in the water. He had something in his hands, and he was hitting his legs with it. Peter tried to crawl to him, but the captain was pulled under the water by something. He quickly stood up and grabbed a rock from the shoreline, because he was not about to be made a victim of what everyone else was. He waited, knowing he would be next. Then it happened. The creature lunged at him and latched onto his knee with a ferocity. Instinct took over, and he began smashing the thing's face with rock over and over. Finally, it fell back into the water, bleeding what looked like a blue hue out of its body. I asked him how that could be possible, and he is alive to tell the tale. Undoubtedly, one of those things didn't kill the entire crew. He said it didn't. He was still alive, so he could sense that I didn't believe him. He began describing what it was that had bitten him that day. He couldn't tell how big it was because it was partially in the water. Finally, he said that it was shaped like a human, but its skin was gray. It was wrinkly towards the edge of the face, but her texture was smooth. Her body was slender, but her teeth, most of all, are what he remembered. Her teeth that bit deep into his knee, straight through the bone. They were at least 3 inches long, and sharper than a knife through butter. Confused, I asked him to clarify what he was saying, and how he knew it was a female. He told the rest of the sailors, as serious as possible, and me that dear boy. It was a mermaid. He knew because he saw some of her scales past her body, which reflected the water's blue. We all looked at him like he was crazy. Indeed, he must have gotten bitten by something else to lose his leg. One of the sailors called him a foolish old man. He said he made it out and lost the leg because the bite got infected, but then he showed us the actual proof. He unbuttoned his shirt and opened it, revealing at least 20 deep scratch scars, and 2 evident bite wound scars. He said while holding his shirt open, they tried to get him while he was adrift at sea. If it weren't for that crab cage, he wouldn't be here right now. I don't know if I believed him or not, but I knew for sure that anything could happen while out at sea. So whether his story was true or not, I always kept a harpoon gun on any vessel I went on. If tonight's story scared you, be sure to hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying stories.